It is the year 1587 in the German town of Dillingen. Anna Hausmanin is a midwife who has cared for countless mothers and newborn children. Now she has been accused of killing them. Her crime is witchcraft. She will be burnt at the stake for it. Under systematic torture, she has confessed to whatever her interrogators wanted to hear. Her judges believe a tide of Satanism is sweeping Germany. The devil has been her lover, she tells them. The babies sacrificed to him. Knowing it would mean her death, she says anything to stop the pain. For 100 years, a witch hunt has been gathering momentum in the heartlands of Europe. Now it will spread like wildfire to the whole continent. The roots of the witch hunt are buried deep in medieval Europe. In 1300, the society of the late Middle Ages in France and Germany is prosperous and stable. People believe in magic and the supernatural, but even the established church see it as an ordinary part of peasant life. The ruling classes think witchcraft is just another folk superstition. The broad mass of the peasantry is outwardly Christian, but their daily lives are full of beliefs in magic and the supernatural handed down from pagan ancestors. Peasants crumble communion wafers on their fields to make crops grow. Where Christianity ends and magic begins, nobody is quite sure.
Magic is part of European life from ancient times, and I'm sure it lasts long after the witchcraft prosecution. Villagers, artisans, learned people were used all kinds of magical devices, special prayers, special sayings, special amulets, other kinds of actions to heal and to harm others in ways that went beyond what the medical profession would prescribe or what the priest would tell one that one could do. People believed that you could influence what went on in someone else's body. There was a kind of porousness about the human body.
In 1300, the science of medicine barely exists, and only for the wealthy. Most people's health is in the hands of midwives like Anna and village wise women who heal with herbs and magic. No one associates these with the devil, at least not yet. Witchcraft is just bad magic, and like good magic, a common fact of peasant life.
The word witch has been used by so many people and abused to mean so many different things. The real original meaning of witch was the priestess or priest or medicine person of a very different kind of religion, a religion of the earth. This is a very organic sense of religion that's probably closer to what Australian Aborigines and Native Americans practice than perhaps religion as most English or American or Western Europeans understand it. So a witch was a practitioner of the things that needed to be done to live. In other words, what do you do to make the crops grow? What do you do to help a community heal from a sickness? What do you do to make sure that births happen in a good way?
Even in the late Middle Ages, witchcraft and magic are still not seen as threats to Christian values. All that is about to change. Europe is on the brink of chaos. Famine, warfare, and disease will sweep across the continent. The orderly feudal society of the Middle Ages will crumble. Its ruins will be haunted by images of demons and hell. In 1309, the Roman Church is split, and the Pope is installed in Avignon by Philip IV of France. The spiritual leadership of Europe is compromised and widely seen to be greedy, decadent, and exhausted. In 1315, and then again the following year, crops fail, leading to widespread famine. Warfare breaks out between England and France, then spreads across Europe. The harmony of medieval society is collapsing in a tide of hunger, bloodshed, and obscenity.
In the Middle Ages, the devil was there, but he was there in the imagination chiefly of hermits, of monks, of religious specialists, in other words. The way in which he penetrates into the lives of lay people and becomes an overwhelming figure, that is very much a feature of this period of transition and conflict.
In October 1347, a Genoese trading ship sails from the Black Sea heading for Sicily. By the time it arrives, the men on board are dead or dying. They have bubonic plague. The Black Death has arrived in Europe. In less than a year, it reaches Germany, France, and England. A year later, it covers the whole of Europe. About 20 million die, a third of the population. Mass burial pits fill, then overflow. The sick die faster than the living can bury them, and nobody has the faintest idea why. There is a desperate search for causes. Wild stories circulate that Jews are poisoning the wells with plague. Pogroms engulf Europe. In Basel, Switzerland in 1349, the entire Jewish community is locked in a wooden house and burned alive. In Antwerp, Mainz, and Strasbourg, thousands go to the stake. Enemies of the church, real or imagined, are sought everywhere.
Medieval order, where everybody, to some extent, shared the same basic suppositions about the cosmos, about the work of God in the world, and so on, had broken down. And the old, rather easygoing political systems also broken down. New centralized states were coming into being, and some of those states were Protestants and others were Catholic. They were in conflict with one another, often at war with one another. And from the point of view of the dominant groups in the various societies, it was a matter of enforcing conformity within the society.
Religious and political leaders begin to imagine that behind the social chaos, mystic forces of evil are at work, that the ghostly legions of the apocalypse have finally arrived. They fear society is being undermined by satanic conspiracies. Political opponents and religious minorities are accused of plotting to turn the Christian order on its head. They are often burned upside down between dogs in a grotesque parody of the crucifixion. Accusations against all heretics are essentially the same: witchcraft. Like the Jews, they are widely portrayed sacrificing children to the devil.
This is a very common technique to create a scapegoat group who may not exist at all, but who in fantasy and imagination represent the exact opposite to the order which is regarded as good and right and proper. They become a kind of collective symbol of chaotic forces, threatening forces. And of course, the supreme threatening force in the Christian world was the devil.
The late Middle Ages get worried about a lot of things. There's less of a fear of externals like Saracens and pagans. There's much more of a threat of the devil within people, of people's dreams and fantasies and private lives and what they get up to between the sheets in the sanctity of their own home.
In the 15th century, Europe becomes obsessed with secret sects of devil worshippers infiltrating society. The most frightening of all witchcraft rituals is an imaginary one, the Sabbat. It has been faithfully represented in a Swedish film, Häxan, from 1922. To Christian authorities, the Sabbat is a wild ceremony of the obscene and sacrilegious. Witches anoint themselves with magic potions and fly to a gathering of wild orgiastic dance, gluttony, and indiscriminate sex. They throw themselves into frenzied revelry urged on by demons. But the Sabbat's ultimate abomination is the ritual sacrifice of newborn babies.
Of course, the function of these age-old fantasies about wild promiscuity, incest, bestiality, eating of children, these too are all ideas which represent chaos. They're the exact opposite to what is supposed to go on. And I believe personally that this is because precisely such periods need a symbol of chaos. If you're trying to make a new cosmos, build a new order, you need something to represent disorder. And the devil did that supremely well.
As the fear of hell grows, so does the science of demonology. Scholars and monks like Richalmus rush to chronicle Satan's growing legion of disciples.
Shax, alias Cox, is a dark and great marquis, like unto a stork with a hoarse and subtle voice.
At night they bring together young girls who they have initiated into their rites.
And there is Glacia Labolas, alias Carcrinolas or Casimola. He's a great president who cometh forth like a dog and hath wings like a griffin.
Just as one watches the hands on a pair of scales to see whether it rises or falls, so do demons ceaselessly observe a man.
By the end of the 15th century, witches and Satan have become inseparable in the minds of most Europeans. The witch hunt is about to begin.
The Great Witch Hunt happened because the rulers of Christian Europe began to believe seriously in witchcraft for the first time. It was an old, peasant, pre-Christian belief which had been around for generations and generations that certain people could work harm by magic. But the Christian church had said that couldn't be true for most of the Middle Ages, because if God is all-powerful, then the devil can't do any damage and nor can witches. But round about 1400, theologians changed their mind and thought the devil might be licensed by God to do real evil in order to make God's plan more perfect, and that made a witch hunt possible.
It begins in Switzerland, France, and southern Germany. Here in the heartland of the witch hunt, thousands are sent to the stake. In the small principality of Bamberg, the accused are subjected to barbaric forms of torture. Even the town's mayor, Johannes Junius, a decent, God-fearing man, stands accused by his enemies.
Many 100,000 good nights, dearly beloved daughter Veronica. Innocent have I come into prison. Innocent have I been tortured. Innocent I must die. For whoever comes into this witch prison must become a witch, or be tortured until he invents something out of his head.
Eventually, everyone more or less believed in this official ideology of demonic witchcraft, and that made it all the easier if, in any case, you had a neighbor whom you didn't like, to accuse, usually her, sometimes him, of attending the Sabbath. Attending the Sabbath was the great crime in demonological witchcraft. Attending the Sabbath, if you did that, you were ripe for burning.
So the Chancellor's son was set before me, who said he'd seen me there. Then the Chancellor was brought, who said the same as his son, and afterward Elsa too. I said, I have never renounced God and will never do it. I'll rather bear whatever I must. And then came, God in his highest heaven have mercy, the executioner, and put the thumb screws on me so that blood spurted from the nails and everywhere, so that for 4 weeks I could not use my hands, as you can see from my writing. When at last the executioner led me back into the prison, he said to me, Sir, I beg you, for God's sake, confess something, whether it be true or not. Invent something, for you cannot endure the torture to which they will put you. One torture will follow another until you say you are a witch. So I made my confession, but it was all a lie.
The old religion of Europe was confused, purposely confused, with the modern Christian notion of Satan. And so what happened through the trial reports and the persecutions is that people were made through torture and persecution and burnings and hangings to in fact say that they were Satanists.
Now, child, you have all my confession, for which I must die. Dear child, keep this letter secret so that people do not find it. Else I shall be tortured most piteously. My hands are already both lame. I am in a sad plight. Good night. For your father, Johannes Junius, will never see you more.
Two days later, Johannes Junius was burnt at the stake.
The witch hunt is at its worst wherever you have decentralized justice, which means that the magistrates trying the victims are in touch with the local populace and infected by their hysterics. It's at its best, from a modern point of view, where the victims are sent for trial far away by professional judges who listen carefully to the evidence. In Germany, you have the land divided into hundreds of tiny states, many of them no bigger than a single town or even a castle and a few villages, where the magistrates are sitting right on top of the bubble of hatred as it bursts, and have to kill the victim in many cases to avoid becoming deeply unpopular themselves.
Torture spread the craze in this way, that a suspected witch usually, but not always, a woman, would be asked whether she had attended this, as it was called, Sabbat, the gathering of witches worshipping the devil. And sufficiently tortured, she would almost always say that yes, she had. She would then be asked, who did she see there? And she would begin to name various people like herself on the whole. Possibly people you disliked, but maybe under extreme torture, anybody you could think of. In this way, you could get a snowball effect, and you could get vast numbers. I mean, in a small village, 100 or more people could be executed in a year or two.
You don't need to execute more than a small number of people in a community the size of most of those across Europe to produce a tragedy. The witch hunt is concentrated in space and time. On one day in Quedlinburg, Germany, they burned 163 women at the stake. You just need to burn 30 people in a small square, typical-sized German town of the period, and you coat the buildings on the leeward side in human fat.
As trials and executions spread, the fledgling states of Europe used the war against satanic witchcraft as a show of force and authority. The message of this gory drama is not lost on a frightened peasant population.
These beliefs are used as a means of propaganda, probably believed in by the people who propagate them, but nevertheless propaganda for intimidating and terrorizing a peasant population.
In 1486, a witch hunter's handbook is published, the Malleus Maleficarum. Translated into all major European languages, this bizarre work only intensifies the hysteria.
You see, the influence of the Malleus Maleficarum was quite appalling. It was, as I said, the witch hunter's manual. And it promulgated just about every superstition about witchcraft that anyone had ever thought up. As a matter of fact, it was an absolutely ridiculous book from the point of view of being factual, but it was setting out to promote the idea that witchcraft was really a terrible, diabolical sect, that they all worshipped Satan, that they were all there for the purpose of doing evil, there was no such thing as a good witch, and they, for the sake of humanity and the survival of civilization and so on, they had to be got rid of.
The Malleus is a do-it-yourself guide to dealing with witches. Their bodies have become inhuman, it says. Witches cannot cry or feel pain, and their skin has numb spots. Once these telltale signs are discovered, the witchcraft must be rooted out. Confession cleanses the soul, while torture reintroduces human feeling into the witch's supposedly numbed body. Most of those accused and ultimately executed are women. As the Malleus carefully argues, their lack of intellect and willpower, along with insatiable sexual desires, make women especially susceptible to Satan's power.
Women also represent, par excellence, secret disorders, the secrets of women around childbirth, the secrets of women around sexual potency and sexual impotency and around fertility, and the belief about women's inferiority, about women's sexuality, about women's lack of resistance to the devil, women's easily being tempted by the devil, women's weak will. I think this goes very nicely with the metaphorical system in which women equal the forces of the occult, the forces of disorder.
Most of the women thought to be witches are over 40. The classic image of the witch is that of an evil mother. They are neither fertile nor nurturing. Witches are a perversion of femininity. they poison the well springs of life.
I think that women are feared when people think about witchcraft. They think about women, partly because there has been such a connection between witchcraft and the processes of life. And women, of course, are very connected to the processes of life. Women are the ones who birth the children. The whole question of how that happens throughout history was a great mystery. And I think that there was a lot of fear connected with women's blood and women's bleeding and women's birthing. The whole profession of midwifery, which ended up being brutally suppressed by the church and also by the medical establishment later, I think has a lot to do with the fear of women having some control over this awesome power.
Midwives like Anna Hausmanin are easy targets, accused of sacrificing babies to the devil. But all female folk healers pose a threat to the male-dominated medical profession, which is struggling to establish itself.
They couldn't qualify as doctors because women were barred from the universities and the medical schools. So if they had to be unqualified, they had no choice. And if they worked as an unqualified healer or practitioner or herbalist, they were ipso facto a witch.
But the witch hunt is not simply a matter of men persecuting women. Although most of the accused are women, most of their accusers are as well.
Many of the conflicts that went on in villages and the accusations were made by women against other women. When we think of village disputes, we shouldn't think of the men lined up on one side and the women on the other. This is partly a world of women's quarrels, and women are perfectly able to internalize all kinds of suspicion and anger at each other in regard to love affairs, in regard to family quarrels, so that women are the actors locally of this healing and harming.
This is a very sad episode in history, actually, the 16th and 17th centuries, when not only here but on the continent also, literally thousands of women were executed as witches.
In 1590, young King James VI of Scotland brings the first witch hunt to the British Isles. Surrounded all his life by conspiracies against his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, King James would conduct one of the most infamous witch trials of the era.
James VI of Scotland was one of the most intelligent and open-minded monarchs ever to rule in the British Isles. He had an open and inquiring mind, and he was a superb writer. And before he went off to Denmark to get married, there is no sign that he was interested in the issue of witchcraft at all.
His marriage is arranged in 1589 to Denmark's Princess Anne. The young king sets out across the North Sea to meet his bride. At first, the fleet makes good progress under clear skies. But then the ships are suddenly and curiously beset by furious storms. Rather than risk the return crossing, the king decides to winter in Denmark with his new wife. His stay there will profoundly affect the rest of his life.
He was having an intellectual sabbatical as well as a honeymoon, and he was talking to some of the hottest Danish academic minds who were preoccupied with the new problem of demonic witchcraft. And he absorbed his ideas straight from the very scholars who were processing the notion of the Satanic Crusade in its most virulent form.
After his return from Denmark, James becomes convinced he is the target of a satanic conspiracy. The Scottish court had always been a hotbed of treachery and political intrigue. the most serious threat coming from Francis, Earl of Bothwell, the king's cousin and rival for the throne. Documents confirm that King James suspects witchcraft is behind his cousin's treason. Soon, 3 women from North Berwick and the Earl of Bothwell stand accused. The king personally supervises their torture and prosecution. The North Berwick witch trials have begun.
James had a very good political motive for becoming keen on hunting witches, because not only did the idea that a satanic crusade is aimed against kings elevate his own claims to rule by divine right, but he also, arguably, wanted to curb the power of one great powerful noble, Bothwell, his own relative. And it was Bothwell who was brought to book for the incident of the North Berwick witches.
The king draws up charges against Bothwell and ensures that they're well publicised.
L. Bothwell hath been detected of witchcraft, and if any such thing may be proved against him, he is here to endure the law.
The actual written indictment is over 4 feet long. Among other accusations, Bothwell is alleged to be the leader of a satanic conspiracy against the throne. In his campaign to destroy Bothwell's reputation, James orders a local priest, Carmichael, to chronicle the trials.
A true discourse of the apprehension of sundry witches lately taken in Scotland, with a particular recital of their examinations conducted in the presence of His Majesty, to the end that their detestable wickedness, which they privily had pretended against the king, should come to light.
Besides Bothwell, another of the accused is Agnes Sampson, a local healer and midwife, known as the Wise Woman of Keith.
Agnes Sampson raised the devil and said to him she had something ado concerning a lord.
Had a black gown and a skull bonnet emblazoned on his head.
Confesses that she consulted with the devil.
And at the New Haven.
It's very difficult to say how much real witchcraft was happening in Lothian at the time that James descended upon North Berwick. There is a clue, perhaps, in part of the confession of Agnes Sampson, who was reputed to be a healer in the neighbourhood. And although most of the people accused of witchcraft in the Great Witch Hunt don't seem to have any kind of dealings with magic, in these cases, such as Agnes, you do find somebody who made a reputation for curing human and animal diseases and working good magic, being shopped as an obvious target for working bad magic.
Told that James Kirkcaldy's wife was
curing Robert Kerse in Dalkeith,
for taking away by witchcraft of the pain and sickness of the Lady Hermiston, the night of her child's delivery.
Like so many before her, Agnes Sampson confesses under torture. She tells of setting to sea with 200 other witches in sieves. Upon coming ashore, they dance and sing to the tune of a Jew's harp, finally gathering in a churchyard for the revelry of an all-night Sabbath.
These confessions made the king most curious, and he sent for the player who upon the said Jew's harp did perform the said dance before His Majesty, who in respect of the strangeness of these matters took great delight to be present.
Come and go ye before, come and go ye, if ye will not go before, come and let me. Ring your widow shins, well and skell and widow shins, deal tag behind most whate'er she be. Come and go ye before, come and go ye, if ye will not go before, come and let me. Ring your widow shins, link the like widow shins, come and down the throne queen, bring go me.
Agnes Sampson's confessions of attempts on the king's life become more and more extravagant as the trial wears on.
They took a cat and christened it, and afterward bound to each limb of that cat the chiefest part of a dead man and several joints of his body. And on the night following, the said cat was conveyed to the middle of the sea by all these witches sailing in their sieves. This done, there did arise in the sea such a tempest as a greater hath not been seen.
This was the storm that nearly shipwrecked King James on his voyage to Denmark. But there would be yet more attempts on his life.
Agnes Sampson affirmed that she, in the company of 9 other witches, convened in the night with the devil their master standing in their midst. A body of wax shapen and made by Agnes Sampson and wrapped in a linen cloth was first delivered to the devil, who, after he had pronounced his verdict, delivered it to Agnes Sampson and she to her next neighbour, and so to everyone round about, repeating, "This is the body of King James VI, ordained to be consumed at the instance of a nobleman, Francis, Earl of Bothwell."
I've read the story about the North Berwick witches, and I certainly think that there was a real coven working there, and I think that Francis Earl Bothwell very probably was the so-called devil, the male leader of it. Because I was very interested in the story of the way that they made the wax image, in particular, how they held it and handed it from one to another in the circle, because I have actually taken part in present-day witchcraft rituals with a wax image, in which we did exactly that.
It is very hard to believe, having sifted through the evidence in detail, as has now been done, that there was a real plot by local Scotswomen and or the Earl of Bothwell to destroy James by magic. What we see instead is a show trial on a Stalinist scale, but employing, just as true Stalinists did, popular fears as well as learned stereotypes.
Agnes Sampson and the other Berwick witches are burned at the stake on Castle Hill, Edinburgh, in August 1593. The Earl of Bothwell escapes to Italy, where he ends his days in exile. Ten years later, James assumes the crown of England as James I and supervises the first English translation of the Bible. He brings his obsession with witches to the task.
James not only claimed divine authority for what he did, he actually rewrote divine authority in the process, in that his authorized version of the Bible, which was to be the standard one in England right up to within living memory, translated Hebrew terms for poisoner and the worker of particular spells under the blanket term of witch, thereby giving a general command to destroy witches.
The Scottish king and his Danish queen dislike the formalities of the London court, but develop a love for English theatre. William Shakespeare writes a play for James that draws upon the king's obsession with witches.
Double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble.
The tragedy of Macbeth is the tale of a Scottish nobleman inspired by witchcraft who assassinates his king and usurps the throne.
Salt sea shark, root of hemlock digged in the dark, liver of blaspheming Jew, gall of goat, slips of yew, slivered in the moon's eclipse, nose of Turk and Tartar's lips.
Yes, the witches in Shakespeare's Macbeth, I believe, had a lot to do with the stories that people had heard, the pamphlets that were produced about the North Berwick witches. And of course, while Shakespeare is making a dramatic thing of it, you know, the weird ingredients on the cauldron, the nose of Turk and Tartar's lips and all that sort of thing, well, of course, that's all rubbish. But some of the herbs that he mentions that went into that witch's cauldron are quite authentic. The deadly yew, which was slivered in the moon's eclipse, and the root of hemlock digged in the dark, that would mean the dark of the moon, which was the time for baleful magic, and still is.
From the time of the New Testament, the image of the devil had changed frequently. But it is only now, during the witch craze, that Europeans begin reading Satanism into age-old village traditions of magic, healing, and witchcraft.
The devil, the so-called Christian devil. Now, have you ever wondered why he's always supposed to have horns and hooves? Because there's no description of the devil in the Bible which says that he's got horns and he's got hoofs and so on, that he's sort of half man and half beast. This picture is the old god Pan. The witches didn't regard him as a power of evil, they regarded him as a power of good. He was simply the masculine side of nature. This is the only sense in which they had a pact with the devil, was that they worshipped the old gods and continued obstinately to worship them after the church told them that all the gods of the heathen are devils.
By the end of the 17th century, Europe's obsession with witchcraft and Satanism is waning.
The witch craze comes to an end simply because the social and religious elite pull the plug on it. As the 17th century goes on, the same people, judges, lawyers, rulers, churchmen, who decided there was a satanic crusade, decide that there isn't.
I think the great witch hunt ended when the modern states were consolidated. It was no longer necessary to have such a demonized group. When the turmoil of the interconfessional wars was over, there was no need.
Some of the institutions of order that the medical profession, that the priests and pastors, that the state was concerned about, were now firmly in place. The state, though it still has lots of uprisings to cope with from their peasants and their city journeymen, the state does have, by the end of the 17th century, stronger military institutions, stronger institutions of police. There's less to be worried about.
But as the witch hunt fades in Europe, it flares again, this time in North America. The year is 1692. The place, the Puritan colony of Salem, Massachusetts.
Salem also fits into another sort of pattern whereby the witch hunt rages most fiercely at the extremities of its range. At the moment, it's dying out in its original heartlands. For example, the worst witch hunting in Poland takes place in the early 18th century, and that's true also of Hungary and of Austria. And so if you look at the western perimeter, you find the American colonies, and Salem is almost the last thing of its kind within the entire English-speaking world.
Salem is fertile ground for a witch hunt. Beset by fear and uncertainty, the community feels isolated and vulnerable in a wilderness filled with terrifying heathens. And in this village of strict religious beliefs, a group of young girls becomes obsessed by strange stories of the occult. Many are orphans, their parents killed in Indian wars. Soon, many innocent lives would be lost. This is the home of Rebecca Nurse before she is unjustly accused and executed.
That it happens in North America, in woodlands that are full of people of different religious practice, must have intensified the anxiety of people deeply concerned about the boundary between the Christian and the non-Christian, between the believing and the diabolic.
It begins on long winter afternoons of play, with the girls being taught games of magic and fortune-telling by a West Indian slave named Tituba. But the games would soon get out of hand.
Look! Look in there! Do you see?
One girl is suddenly overcome by seizures and hallucinations. Hysteria and convulsions quickly spread to the others.
The Puritans of Salem brought over the ideas of witchcraft and the devil that their ancestors had in Europe, and they also brought over many of the patterns of village life and town life that caused trouble and conflict in Europe.
Salem is a bitterly divided community. Its founding families are strict Puritans. For years they've governed with religious intolerance and a punishing moral code. Now newcomers threaten their authority. There is resentment and anger on both sides. Samuel Parris, a bigoted and sanctimonious preacher, is the first to diagnose the girl's convulsions as satanic possession.
The devil hath been raised amongst us, and his rage is vehement and terrible. And when he shall be silenced, the Lord only knows.
At public town meetings, the girls are encouraged to reveal everyone in Salem associated with devil worship. Pressed, they begin naming names.
I think that they lived very circumscribed lives. Certainly Puritan culture would indicate that. Certainly the history would indicate that. And when you're coming into puberty, suddenly you're flowering, you're sensing your own power in some sense, and suddenly these young girls in that courtroom situation or in that trial situation understood that they had a lot of power. They could make people die. They could make people be put in jail. That's a very heady experience.
Not bring Satan with you.
Amid the hysteria, the girls claim to see Satan everywhere, leading to a storm of accusations. 70 are held for trial. Cotton Mather, a Boston clergyman, chronicles the witch hunt.
The New Englanders are a people of God, settled in those lands which were once the devil's territories. We have now, with horror, seen the discovery of his plot. An army of devils is horribly broken in upon Salem.
I have no idea if there were witches in Salem. I think most of the people who died in Salem were not witches. Most of them were good Christians. And most of them were good Christian women, often women who lived alone, who perhaps had property, who were women of influence, and who got on the bad side of their communities for other reasons that had very little to do with witchcraft.
20 people were executed in Salem, hanged rather than burnt at the stake. But vindication for Rebecca Nurse and the others who died was not long in coming. Judges from England, who no longer believed in witchcraft, urged blame and humiliation on the accusers. 5 years later, an official day of apology and remorse was declared. The witch craze was over.
Estimates of the final death toll in the Great Witch Hunt range from 9 million, which was never an academic estimate, it was a guess made in the 1890s, down to 40,000. I'm afraid, or perhaps I should be glad, that 40,000 is the latest, most carefully researched academic figure.
There were undoubtedly many victims of the witch craze. I've read on the continent there were cases of whole villages where there was only one woman left alive in it. Everybody else had been executed as witches. It really was a terrifying craze, and undoubtedly many of the people who were executed in the course of this mass hysteria were not witches at all. And some of them were simply people who'd managed to fall foul of the authorities somehow. But in their defense, I would say, well, you tried hanging us and burning us, but we're back.